But take care and watch yourself closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. It's worth remembering that phrase from Deuteronomy over and over. Some 20 years ago, Paul Thomas Anderson released a film called Magnolia, which followed a series of characters across several days. Two of those individuals, a younger woman and an older man, are struggling with inner demons whose source we can't quite name. Whatever is happening inside of them is driving them toward various kinds of self-destructive behaviors. It's clear in the film that somehow they know each other, but it's not clear how. But toward the end of the film, there's a moment of truth-telling and revelation in which it emerges that there had been a pattern of abuse and then denial perpetrated against the young woman by the older man. It becomes clear that the source of the woman's inner turmoil, which manifests for her in substance abuse and an inability to maintain lasting relationships, is rooted in a trauma which had never been fully addressed or fully acknowledged. In a very crucial moment, what for me is the climax of the film, the camera focuses upon words that are attached to her bedroom mirror, zooming in. Words that evidently she had placed there in order to maintain her sanity. The words are these: "But it did happen." I want to use those words, "but it did happen," to introduce the project that we have been working on for the last 6 months around here. It's a project that we have chosen to call Wheels of Justice, Stories from the Deep North. After the murder of George Floyd and then the racial reckoning that followed, I, along with many others, began going back to older sources in our nation's history, having to do with civil rights, and then also those having to do with the Civil War and Reconstruction. And much of what I, along with many others, explored pertained especially to the South, an area that I have come to know a little over the past several years, an area that many of us explored together 4.5 years ago on our first Wheels of Justice journey. But the more I read and the more I listened over these past 6 months, the more it became clear that there were stories that needed to be told right here, in our own backyard. And I mean that pretty literally. There's a story that needs to be told in my backyard, which I'll tell you one day soon. And so little by little, I began to unearth stories of racial injustice and stories of bold resistance to that injustice that occurred throughout New England, but especially in southern New England, and especially in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Mary Tomasetti has become my companion on this journey, as on many journeys. We spent a lot of days driving around southern New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, talking to people about the project, exploring sites, sometimes receiving encouragement, and sometimes being told that we weren't welcome there. And then we went and enlisted some friends to help us narrate the stories on video in order to share them with you. We're starting to do that today, to share the stories with you. Some of the friends, some of the narrators you'll know well. Some will be new to you. But they're all committed to sharing these particular stories, insisting with that movie Magnolia, but it did happen. Wheels of Justice, Stories from the Deep North, will be a multi-week sermon series. And it will be a virtual tour of the spaces around us here in New England. On this virtual journey, we're interested in the it of that statement. It did happen. We're concerned to establish what happened around us, because the what has been occluded and hidden for too long. But we're also very interested in the where of it all, which is to say, in the places in which the what occurred. It's worth telling you that almost none of the spaces we visited were marked. And yet there are things that took place in those spaces, which are all around us, that need to be reckoned with. It's also worth telling you that if there was a marker of some kind, it was often a very whitewashed version of the story that omitted any mention of racial injustice or slavery or ethnic cleansing. Many of these are spaces you probably know or have driven past, in Old Lyme and in Deep River, in Mystic and in New London, and other places like it. I conceive of this virtual journey as a project in what I'm calling expressive geography, using space, the places we know and inhabit, to instruct us about forgotten lives, forgotten truths, and about our own moral obligations. Expressive geography is a way of allowing ourselves to inhabit the world around us just a little bit differently. I want you to be haunted by what you learn here. I want you to be disturbed by it. I want the spaces you inhabit to become haunted as well. Every time you drive by them, or visit a restaurant nearby, or stroll through one of the places that I'll soon show you, I want you to be reminded, voluntarily or otherwise, but it did happen here, not somewhere else. In New England, not somewhere in the deep South. Here in Connecticut and Rhode Island, in the deep North. Today we'll be hearing from two friends. Carolyn Wakeman will explore a familiar site here in Old Lyme that was once a space of enslavement. And after that, we'll head out to Mystic, where a new friend named Michael Kickingbear Johnson will share the history of ethnic cleansing that occurred in what is now a neighborhood in Mystic. An ethnic cleansing that allowed our colonial ancestors to build homes and communities along the Connecticut shoreline. I hope you'll come along with us on this Wheels of Justice journey through the deep North. And I hope you'll be changed by it. Let's go join Carolyn now.
Good morning. I'm standing in front of the north side of the Florence Griswold Museum. Many of you will recognize it from the front. You may not recognize the north side of the building. But I'm here this morning to tell you some stories about an earlier period when this was a site of enslavement. In fact, fact, there were several sites of enslavement on Upper Lyme Street. And by sites of enslavement, what I mean is that these are properties where enslaved people labored between the late 1600s and the early 1800s. Behind me is the kitchen L of the original William Noyce house that stood on this site until 1816. It's a little bit hard to imagine, but this beautiful front section of the house, what we know as Miss Florence's house, was built in 1818. Before that, there was an earlier house on the front of the site, but the kitchen L, as far as we know, remained here. And in that kitchen L, a family of enslaved African Americans labored for at least 4 decades, perhaps longer. Their names were Prince and Jenny, and they served William Noyce and his family, at least by 1771. I use the date 1771 because that's when their oldest child, whose name was Nancy, was born. She may well have been born right here, in this kitchen L. At least it was typical for enslaved persons to live in the attic above the kitchen in some households. Nancy had at least 4 siblings. She had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. They all lived in this kitchen L, we think. At least we guess, we hypothesize that they lived here. And they would have been performing various kinds of labor as they grew older. I'd like you to think for a moment about the date, 1771, when Nancy was born. That's 5 years before the Declaration of Independence, and her siblings were all born after that, up until 1790. So this family was enslaved here in this beautiful house on this property for quite a number of years. We have a lot of records of this family, actually. A later descendant wrote a list of William Noyce's slaves, and we have that list preserved in a scrapbook here in the archives at the Florence Griswold Museum. We also have birth records, and we have some emancipation records. So through these documents and through the land records, we can piece together the story of an African American family that grew up in this town on Lyme Street a number of years ago, 200 years ago. We don't know very much about Jenny and Prince. We know that Prince died at sea in 1791, leaving Jenny a widow with 5 children for the next several decades. We know that Jenny was still living in 1826 when her second child, Prince, died in a house just across the street. And we know that the Noyce family owned 4 houses here on what today is Upper Lyme Street, what's now the Bee and Thistle Inn, about to become the Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center, a house that was long ago demolished right across the street, and another house a little bit further up on the east side of what was the highway through Lyme. But the Noyce family were not the only enslavers on this part of Lyme Street. Before them, just after 1700, across the street, in a house owned by or built by Joseph Peck Jr., there were other enslaved people living. And I'd like to tell you also about them and give you their names. We know about those enslaved people from 2 sources. One, Joseph Peck Jr. kept an account book, and that account book we can read today in the Connecticut State Library. In that account book, we can read on different pages that Joseph Peck, sold sugar and he sold rum by the pint and also by the quart. That rum must have come from Barbados. The trade with Barbados that involved Lyme merchants had begun decades before this. It was not new. But Joseph Peck was selling these items, sugar and rum, from his store or his warehouse or perhaps his house across the street from where I'm standing. The account book also tells us on 2 different pages that Joseph Peck rented out a black boy for daily labor. In 1715, he rented out a black boy for 1 day for a certain price. And 3 years later, he rented out that same black boy with a harrow, so that boy could perform agricultural labor with Joseph Peck providing the farm implement. So Peck was selling sugar and rum, but he was also selling slaves. In 1726, he sold from this house across the street a 20-year-old woman named Temperance. He sold her to a neighbor of sorts whose name was Richard Lord, who lived in what we now call the Tantamahake section of Lyme. 3 years after that, Joseph Peck Jr. sold a child. The child's name was Jane. She was a mulatto, it says in the deed of sale. We have the bill of sale, the record of the sale in Lyme's land record, so we can read it very easily. It's right there for anyone to find. And he sold Jane, her name was Jane, a 3-year-old mulatto child called Jane. He sold her to someone named Benjamin Reed. It's interesting to try to put these three people together. We can certainly speculate that the black boy had grown up by the time Jane was born in 1726. The child had grown up, and Jack could well have been that child's father. So in this house across the street, we have at least potentially, hypothetically, we have the black boy who grew up, and his name by the time he was older was probably Jack, because we know from church records that Jack, the enslaved Negro man of Joseph Peck Jr., died in, I think it was 1738 or 1734. So we have Jack living here, we have Temperance living here, we have Jane living here, and then a number of years later, 50 years later, 40 years later, we have Prince and Jenny living in the house behind me. So Lyme Street, what we know today as beautiful scenic Lyme Street, has a history that's not familiar to many of us who live in this town. For many of us who live here and who come here to enjoy the Florence Griswold Museum and the jazz club across the street at the Old Lyme Inn, these are wonderful cultural sites for us to visit. But now what we're beginning to understand is that there's another history to these sites as well, and that's a history of enslavement. Because we know the names of these people, we know their ages, we know their dates, we can now make them part of a chapter of our local history, a chapter that was forgotten for many years.
Well, we've just come from Old Lyme, where Carolyn Wakeman narrated some of the stories of the enslaved who lived on Lyme Street. And we're now in Mystic. And I wanted to bring you out here to introduce you to our next story. We're standing on Pequot Avenue, and behind me is a tree that is considered to be sacred by the Pequot people. It was placed there in the 90s after they removed a statue of John Mason, who was the captain who led the massacre of the Pequot people, which took place on this very site where we're standing. We're some 400, and some estimates are as large as 600 to 700 Pequot people were massacred by settlers. That's a story that's going to be told in just a moment by Michael Kickingbear Johnson, a new friend, who agreed to tell this story for us. He's a member of the Pequot Nation, but he also shared that it's too painful for him to come to this particular site to do it. And so he's chosen to do it off-site. But I wanted you to be able to see it before we meet Michael. And so without further ado, I'll let Michael take over the story.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for allowing me a little bit of time in your program to speak to you today about kind of a trying time for myself personally. My name is Michael Johnson. I am an enrolled member of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation. My job for my tribe is I'm the Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, working on matters of cultural and historic preservation. My traditional name is called Kikishkom, which roughly translates to kicking bear, and given to me by of course, my parents, who gave me both my, we'll say, colonial names as well as my traditional name. So that's how I got that. So I've been asked to sort of speak about part of my tribal history that's a bit difficult to talk about. So I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about, I guess it would be Connecticut history, but it's sad history for myself personally, because of events that transpired that go largely unknown, especially across the United States, I would say. Here in Connecticut, I think most people are aware of the Mashantucket Pequot tribe and perhaps aware of the War of 1637. But then again, I come across quite a few people that don't. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit today. I will be reading quite a bit of this as a narrative, so I do apologize for constantly glancing down at a screen. But so I guess we'll go ahead and kick this off. So, all right. So our Pequot Nation, before the conventional understanding of the Indian Relocation Act and the establishment of a reservation system here in the United States, my ancestors occupied much of the interior of Connecticut land base, all the way to the shoreline. Larger villages were in places such as Noank and even Waterford. The trade was a very big part of what was taking place. Actually, trade goes back as early as the 1500s. But for my people, we more or less talk about trade beginning in the 1600s. So that's really what the areas that I'm going to be referring to. So it was one of the earliest examples of capitalism here in the United States, along with slavery. It was also the first interaction between my ancestors and the Dutch and the English. This occurred fairly regularly with our people. Trade was one of the first methods of communication between Europeans and indigenous peoples. For colonists, however, it was about building infrastructure and relationships they needed to stay and survive here in an early state of Connecticut. For our people, It was more often about trying to adjust to a growing new reality of unfamiliar people interacting with us and building potential alliances. After only about 5 years since the establishment of Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts in 1621, they no longer were financially dependent on England due to the foundations that it had built with its rather tenuous relationship with the Wampanoag people and also its early local economy there. Trade continued all along the coast between Massachusetts and Connecticut. Trade between our tribe and also a bartering system was established by the native peoples and the colonists at that time. The Native Americans provided skins, hides, food, and also knowledge of different places in the area that we know locally. There were also territorial disputes between tribes as well. For example, the Narragansett and my Pequot ancestors. There were also internal political divisions. There were disagreements between Pequot leaders, such as that of my ancestor Sassacus and also Uncas. Those disagreements led to Uncas leaving the Pequot Nation, taking some of his followers with him. They later became known as Mohegan. Trade also led, sadly, to the Pequot War of 1637. In 1634, my ancestor, a Pequot sachem, who was also considered a high leader amongst our people, his name was Tattlebaum. He was kidnapped, ransomed, and eventually murdered by a Dutch trader. In retaliation, Tattlebaum's son killed a notorious English trader named John Stone. Now, misunderstandings were rampant back then because of language challenges and also visual misinterpretations. So what I mean by that is all indigenous peoples looked the same to the Dutch and the English, and all white men looked the same to my people. Now, with murders having occurred on both sides, each wanted some form of justice, but for different reasons. The English believed an eye for an eye for the most part. For indigenous people, however, it was about balance. For example, during wars, it was common for prisoners to be taken. If indigenous people took captives, they often were integrated into tribal communities, whereas the English often killed their indigenous captives or sold them into slavery. Again, going back to a capitalist society, right? Now, despite the two deaths, the English demanded more justice. And despite the desire of my ancestors to have peace, the English marched and began randomly killing innocent Pequot men, women, and sadly children to obtain the justice that they felt that they were denied. Now, in 1636, Pequot sachem Sassacus, now seen as the highest leader, met with leaders of the Narragansett Nation to seek their help to fight the English, who were still periodically killing Pequot people. They denied Sassacus the help that he was seeking due to past territorial disputes. So that was, in essence, like a closed door. In the meantime, however, the English had established a fort in what we know today as Old Saybrook, Connecticut. It was also an English settlement. The English documented periodic attacks by Pequots on that fort, especially in the fall of 1636. So by April of 1637, English soldiers met with Uncas, the sachem of the Mohegan, and granted to him muskets in exchange for his alliance with the English to fight our people. Then on May 18th, 1637, Captain John Mason arrives at Fort Saybrook to take command of an army of English, Mohegan, and Narragansetts and plan the attack on our main village, which was near present-day Mystic, Connecticut. We use the Connecticut River and to travel quite extensively, actually, from our village sites all along the river down to the sea. Our traditional fishing and hunting grounds were all along the Connecticut River. Over time, as colonization took place, when the English were setting up and expanding their own settlements, our people were being systematically pushed back farther and farther away from not only the Connecticut River, but away from the sea. So as part of the planning for the attack on our village, the English boarded ships and set sail down the Connecticut River and headed out to sea. Now we had hunters out trying to gather and bringing food back to the village, and they had witnessed this. And we believed at that time that the English had actually begun to leave to go back to England. Then on May 23rd of 1637, the English soldiers disembarked from their ships on small boats and rowed back to shore in Narragansett territory. They marched from there out to the site of our people and made their way to a staging point, readying for an attack on our mystic village. The Narragansett and the Mohegan staged at two other locations, effectively surrounding our village a short distance away. Thursday evening of May the 25th, 1637, the English, with indigenous allies, readied themselves to attack our village during our prayer ceremonies. And it was documented by the English, but as well as we understand from Mohegan and Narragansett as well, that they could hear our prayers. They could hear us singing in the distance from within the village site that evening. And Mohegan sage Chamunkist asked Captain John Mason to spare the Pequot women and children, stating that it was, quote, their way. What makes this hard for me personally is that Uncas knew that, politics aside, these were still his people, historically speaking, that he was about to attack us. And then in the dawn of May 26th of 1637, our village was in fact attacked. And estimates ranged between 400 to 600 of our people were massacred at Mystic Fort that day, that dawn. The war is one of many examples of the resilience of my Pequot people. However, sadly, there are literally thousands of stories of death and trauma to Indigenous people like this that largely go unheard by most American people. But many of those tribes have survived as well, and our current descendants are testimony of the strength and remembrance of our great ancestors. So I really want to thank you for your time in listening to this story. And again, it pertains to history here, not only in Connecticut, but obviously here in the United States. Again, I say thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I'd like to say kutupatosh in our language, which means thank you. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.
We're back in the meeting house, back where we began. Back here to insist that it did happen. It did happen. As Carolyn narrated, Prince and Jenny, Nancy, Jack and Temperance and Jane, their lives were conducted here in Old Lyme. It did happen. And then with Michael, we insist that 400 or more were slaughtered in Mystic. It did happen. We need to reckon with those words now more than ever. Where there has been trauma, it becomes immeasurably worse when it is denied, when it is ignored, or when it is forgotten. By contrast, what healing is possible can only occur by telling the stories, maybe over and over again, and then by listening, and by having our hearts become a little more broken. What healing is possible can only come by insisting, but it did happen. That's why we need these stories from the deep north. We who are predominantly white. I'll close this first segment of our Wheels of Justice journey by referring to our scripture lesson for the day, the second lesson. The book of Ephesians tells us that we must no longer be children, tossed about by this or that deception, by this or that spin, by this or that lie or half-truth. We have been tossed about by deceptions and spin and lies and half-truths. But the instruction of the book of Ephesians is that we must come to maturity. And maturity is the ability to reckon with hard truths and to withstand painful revelations, and to do so without shrinking or hiding. Maturity, in the sense that Paul means it in Ephesians, is to recognize our connections to other people, especially to those others who have been invisible to us and to their stories. It is to say, we have too often not heard what you have been trying to tell us. But right now, we're trying to listen. That's what it means to be knit together in love. We're trying to listen to these stories from the deep north, such that we too can learn to put away falsehood, to put away whitewashing, and begin to speak honestly to ourselves and to our neighbors. I hope you'll continue to come with us on this journey through the deep north. Amen.